Welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about the 1993 movie called Tombstone. Now that is arguably one of the most popular movies about the American Old West, so I'm sure you already know the story. But just as a refresher, in case it's been a little bit since you've seen it, let's do our normal synopsis anyway. Directed by George Cosmatos and Kevin Jarre, Tombstone tells the tale of the events leading up to, during, and after the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. The movie follows Wyatt Earp, who's played by Kurt Russell, as a retired lawman looking to strike it rich in the boomtown of Tombstone, Arizona. Joining him there are Wyatt's brothers, Virgil and Morgan Earp, along with their good friend, Doc Holliday. Oh, and Virgil is played by Sam Elliott, Bill Paxton plays Morgan Earp, and Val Kilmer plays Doc Holliday. When they get to Tombstone, they encounter a group of outlaws known as the Cowboys. They're led by Curly Bill Brocious and Johnny Ringo. Curly Bill is played by Powers Booth in the movie, while Michael Biehn plays Johnny Ringo. Tensions escalate between the Earps and the Cowboys, leading to a series of violent confrontations. After a deadly encounter between Curly Bill and Marshal Fred White that finds the Marshal getting killed, Virgil Earp becomes the new U.S. Marshal and, along with his brothers, vow to bring the Cowboys to justice. The film includes probably the most popular on-screen depiction of the iconic gunfight at the OK Corral, where the Earp brothers, along with Doc Holliday, face off against the Cowboys in a legendary shootout. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, we'll be joined by author Tom Clavin, who is a New York Times best-selling author of numerous books, including this one called Tombstone: The Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from Hell. He also has a brand new book available for pre-order right now called Throne of Grace: A Mountain Man, an Epic Adventure, and the Bloody Conquest of the American West. Of course, you'll find a link to both of Tom's books in the show notes for this episode. But before we connect with Tom, let's set up our game: Two Truths and a Lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you three things. Two of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Doc Holliday was a fantastic marksman. Number two, Bat Masterson was almost in the gunfight at the OK Corral also. Number three, the gunfight at the OK Corral was only about 30 seconds. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Tom Clavin about the historical accuracy of Tombstone. Even though no one expects movies to be entirely accurate, some movies do better than others. So let's start today by getting a sense of how well today's movie did with history. If you were to give Tombstone an overall letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
I would give it a B+.
B+.
And approaching an A-. It's really borderline. It does a good job. There are some liberties taken, but when you consider some of the previous treatments of the whole gunfight at the OK Corral story and how far off the mark they are, Tombstone does a very good job of trying to stick to the facts.
Yeah, that's a lot better than I was expecting. A lot of movies don't even really try.
Well, you look at something like My Darling Clementine. So many people refer to that as like the classic movie about the gunfight at the OK Corral, and objectively, it is a really good Western. John Ford, Henry Fonda as Wyatt Earp, Walter Brennan as the head of the Clanton gang. It's a really good movie, but it's sort of stitched together a lot of embellishments and outright falsehoods. I think if I remember correctly, I have the very stocky and robust Victor Mature playing Doc Holliday. He doesn't look like he's ever been sick a day in his life. One of the Earp brothers dies before the gunfight at the OK Corral. So, that's an example of the kind of liberties that were taken. So when Tombstone came along, I have to credit them with really trying this. And Maurice, I think it's Kevin Jarre is the screenwriter. His script really did try to make the effort to stick. And I think what he found, which is not a revelation to most people, and it certainly has been a big part of my career, is that you can find that the historical accuracy can be as interesting, if not more so, than what they made up.
As they say, truth is stranger than fiction sometimes.
Sometimes it's even just more entertaining too.
Speaking of Tombstone, at the beginning of that movie, we're introduced to Wyatt Earp along with his brothers, Virgil and Morgan. And we see the three brothers arriving in Tucson, Arizona first, along with their three wives, Allie, Louisa, and Maddie. And we see the six traveling onto the boomtown that the movie is named after. Tombstone is how it's referred to there. The movie also points out that Wyatt Earp is already a legendary lawman. He's retiring his badge to start a peaceful life with his family. This is how the movie sets it up in the beginning. Oh, and you mentioned Doc Holliday. Their friend Doc Holliday is there too because he's hoping the dry climate will relieve his tuberculosis. Do you think the movie did a good job giving an introduction to this story before the main characters even got to Tombstone?
I think they did a good job of setting up the story rather efficiently, and showing that right off the bat, you show that these are not just lone cowboys and retired ex-lawmen roaming the range. They have committed relationships. I mean, Virgil, especially with his wife Allie, they might have been the only ones of the bunch that were actually married. It was pretty common in those days that common law marriage was pretty much accepted. If you stayed together long enough, you called yourself Mrs. Earp, or Mrs. Jones, whatever. So I think they set it up pretty effectively and efficiently. And you mentioned in your question about Wyatt Earp being presented as a legendary lawman. It really was Tombstone and then the Earp revenge ride, or the retaliation ride has got different names that put him more into the legend book. I mean,
okay.
To be accurate, from coming from Dodge City, Wyatt had a reputation, a good one, from his tenure in Dodge City, but he wasn't even a marshal there. He was a deputy marshal, and we worked under the marshal in Dodge City. So he was not by any means a legendary character when he got to Tombstone. It was Tombstone really that made him got him that legendary status.
Okay, yeah, because when he arrives there in the movie, I don't remember who it is, but somebody's at the local law there is already asking him, be like, hey, come join us. It just seems like he's already this legend that his reputation precedes him, was the impression I got.
Yeah, and that's pretty common when they presented Wyatt Earp in the movies, that sometimes there's even one of the earlier movies, I think, when he's portrayed by Randolph Scott, when he gets to Dodge City, he's already a legend. He had just had a couple of small-time jobs before that. But that makes sense, dramatically. Why should you spend another hour and a half with this guy if he's rather an insignificant character?
That's the origin story that they always have in movies. Something else that we see in the movie that it sets up here is the bad guys in the movie. They call themselves the Cowboys. And the movie sets it up that they're made up of over 100 exiled Texas outlaws who banded together to be, as the movie puts it, the earliest example of organized crime in America. And they're led by Curly Bill Brocious, that's their leader. And they all wear red sashes. I thought this was very convenient for the movie to do this. It made it very easy to spot the bad guys in the movie. But was the movie setup of the Cowboys accurate?
It was pretty accurate, because what was going on is that Cowboys in the 1860s, 1870s, even to the 1880s were really a derogatory name, or at least they were. First time you see cowboys used, often it was hyphenated, cow-boy, and basically it was somebody who herded cows, which is not the most well-respected occupation at the time. So cowboys were also those who tended to not adhere to the letter of the law. They weren't all criminals by any means. A lot of them were hardworking, honest, but they came into town with their paychecks and they spent it on wine, women, and song, shooting things up. They could sometimes make it a real difficult time, especially for those cow towns in the 1870s, like Dodge City and Abilene and some of the others at the end of the trail when they came up from Texas. So there was a kind of gang warfare going on in and around Tombstone in the late 1870s, 1880s. You had ranchers who employed most of the cowboys, like the Clantons and like the McLaurys and others. They had been there for quite some time, most of them, and they wanted to keep things the way they were and have access to town whenever they wanted it, and they could pretty much do what they wanted and do some rustling on the side, do some stealing of them from gals from Mexico. And then you had a different kind of gang represented by the Earp brothers, or Earp family, where they did not come to Tombstone to be any kind of lawmen, to be any kind of let's make civilization stronger in Tombstone. They were there to make money. That was the thing. But in order to make money, you had to have a certain kind of structure and peacefulness, and you couldn't be having cowboys shooting the town up every Saturday night. Reluctantly and inevitably, the Earp gang was sort of getting into a warfare with the cowboy gangs, and which eventually reached you could say it reached its climax with the gunfight at the OK Corral, but unlike a lot of books and movies, the story does not end with the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Upon arriving at Tombstone in the movie, Wyatt Earp immediately sets up the brothers with a way to make money. There's a rather vacant barn town called the Oriental, run by a guy named Milt Joyce. The reason it's vacant in the movie is because of a guy named Johnny Tyler. He's played by Billy Bob Thornton in the movie. And he's described as someone who just barged in one day and then started dealing at the faro table and run off all the customers. Milt, the owner of the Oriental, can't seem to get rid of him. And so that's Johnny Tyler, the guy who came in. Milt can't get rid of him. So Wyatt Earp comes in and scares off Johnny Tyler. After that, the basic setup seems to be that the Earp brothers are working at the Oriental, almost some kind of protection, it seems, from Johnny Tyler or someone like him. And then in exchange, they get 25% of the house's take. Is that a good portrayal of how the Earps made money in Tombstone?
Yeah, it's a shorthand version, but it's pretty much based on fact. And the Earp brothers, it does make them cast them in like an unflattering light, but that's what they could do. They could offer protection. I mean, when earlier in his so-called career, Wyatt and was a bouncer at his brother's bordellos, and they ran kind of a protection racket in Wichita and elsewhere, and so it was something they did. The brothers all stood together at any particular time. There could be 4 brothers involved with Jim and Morgan and Wyatt and Virgil. So the same thing in Tombstone is they saw an opportunity. They were also investing in some silver mines, because that's what was really powering the economy in Tombstone, was the mining and the surrounding hills. But that's kind of iffy. It's a little more of a sure thing if you could run a gambling house and offer protection and keep the money. It was, for all as far as we know, it was not a crooked gambling house, but still, the way gambling houses was set up, the house usually won anyway. Part of the story there is that Wyatt was head of security, let's say, is a better way to put it, of the Oriental. And then when things were getting a little more heated between he and other gambling houses, he requested his friend Bat Masterson to come visit to help him out, become like the assistant head of security, which is what happened. So in 1881, Bat Masterson was in Tombstone with his pals, the Earp brothers. If it wasn't for the fact that back in Dodge City, one of Bat's brothers was being threatened with being killed, and Bat had to make his way back to Dodge City to straighten that situation out, he may well have also been part of the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which would have made it even more of a legendary event.
Yeah. It's already pretty legendary. It's hard to imagine how much more it could be, but yeah, for sure.
Just imagine if you had, and it was actually truth. You had Virgil, Morgan, Wyatt, Doc Holliday, Bat Masterson facing off against the Clantons and the McLaury. That would have been, even more sensational.
Oh yeah. I can imagine. Wow. But somebody else I want to ask about that we see in the movie are the Mr. Fabian and Josephine Marcus. They arrive in Tombstone with their trooper performers, and they start putting on shows at the local theater. And immediately Josephine seems to catch Wyatt's eye, much to the chagrin of Wyatt's wife, Maddie. And this is just an ongoing thing that we see throughout the movie. So can you share some more historical context around the dynamic between Wyatt and Maddie and Josephine that we see in the movie?
Josephine is a fascinating character in the Wyatt Earp legend. She is often portrayed, and with some accuracy, of coming to Tombstone as an actress. I think in my book she's part of a troupe that's performing a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta that's traveling around, and that's was often happened in those days. These traveling troops of entertainers. That's how they made some money, and how the towns got some entertainment when they were out on the frontier. And she did catch Wyatt's eye. Inconveniently, she was the fiance of Johnny Behan, the marshal, or the sheriff, I should say, of Ford County, not Ford County, of the county. I think it was Cochise County that eventually got separated to a different county. And they had this romance, and then they lived happily ever after Tombstone. And to some extent, that's quite true. I mean, she was also a prostitute, Josephine Marcus, and early in her life, and she wrote a book that came out kind of rather late in her life. She lived into the 1940s, Josephine Marcus. I mean, she was quite elderly, and she was very close to one of the Earps, to Allie Earp, Virgil's widow, and they were very close. And I think they're actually buried next to each other, and also lived a long life. And so Josephine wrote a book that was a total whitewash. I married Wyatt Earp, or I was Wyatt Earp's wife, something like that. It was pretty much a whitewash that portrayed her in such this complimentary light, most of which was just made up. But having said that, there did seem to be a genuine romance there. And once the whole Tombstone business was done, and Wyatt went to fetch Josie, who had been sort of sheltering in San Francisco, they were together for the next 40-something years. Now, portrayed by Dana Delaney, I don't blame him.
Yeah, I mean, there had to have been something real there. I mean, like you mentioned, if she was friends with Virgil's widow for even beyond, the brothers being there, that's not for show. That's not something that you're just doing for whatever the benefits may be of,
Right. And she was Wyatt's fourth wife.
Oh, okay.
It seems like he finally got it right on the fourth time around. It wasn't like she was number 4 and there was 5 and 6 and 7. He had these other relationships, and then he and Josie got together, and that was it for both of them for the next 40-something years.
Well, it seems like in the movie he talks about how he wanted to retire and settle down. It seems like that's kind of what he was going for.
He retired as a lawman, but they did anything but settle down. They roamed for decades. I mean, literally, they roamed the West. He ran a barn in Alaska. He sold real estate in San Diego, California. They were always moving around. They didn't stay too long in one place until in the later years. They were pretty much set in a cottage in Los Angeles, and he was getting some work as an advisor on silent film westerns.
Ah, okay. I guess settling down is a metaphorical term for a relationship.
You get more gunfights.
Well, speaking of gunfights, if we go back into the movie, there is a major turn of events. Curly Bill gets drunk one night and then just is shooting off his guns in the middle of the road. The marshal, Fred White, goes out to stop him, but then Curly Bill shoots and kills the marshal. Since Sheriff Behan won't do anything about it, Virgil Earp seems to feel bad for the people of Tombstone, and so Mayor Clum makes Virgil the new marshal in town. And one of the first things that Virgil does is to post an ordinance prohibiting anyone from carrying a gun in town. Of course, the cowboys don't follow this rule. Then we find out Morgan has a badge too, but Wyatt isn't quite going back to being a lawman yet. Was Marshal White being killed by Curly Bill kind of the catalyst that the movie seems to imply for the Earps getting swept up into law enforcement in Tombstone?
It was a very important turning point because Marshal White was a well-regarded figure in Tombstone, and it was pretty much the killing of the marshal was kind of like an accident. So it wasn't like Curly Bill got drunk and said, "I'm going to get rid of this marshal because he's bothering me." He was trying, sort of like kidding around with the marshal, like, "Okay, here's my gun," and he gives him the gun, and the marshal grabs the barrel of the gun, and the way he pulls it, Curly Bill's finger is still on the trigger or near the trigger, and the gun goes off. So, okay, technically, it was an accident that the marshal got killed, and that one gunshot was enough to kill him too. But it was like crossing a line in the sand. You killed the well-regarded lawman, and there was a vacuum there. Usually after a marshal gets killed, there's not a long line of applicants. And But Virgil did feel a sense of responsibility, and he had law enforcement experience, having worked as a law enforcement officer, as deputies elsewhere, and back in Prescott. I think he was a deputy marshal in Prescott before he and his wife came to Tombstone. So he thought he would step into that vacuum and maybe, calm things down a little bit, which, he kind of did, and he's good for the role in it. This is also where I think the casting of the films, both this film, Tombstone, and the other Wyatt Earp film called Wyatt Earp, really helps because, as much as people remember Val Kilmer from the movie Tombstone, maybe next to that or second to next to that, I remember Sam Elliott as Virgil Earp. His presence in the movie as the older brother is really very powerful, even though he doesn't have a lot to say. In real life, Virgil didn't have a lot to say, but his presence was influential, and it's also, I think, I drew Sam Elliott as part of that quadrant, that trio of brothers.
Yeah, I think he did a great job of being that. He was the one that they could kind of go to for whatever sort of insights they might want that you might expect from an older brother, but also just kind of silently there,
right,
letting you know what's right and wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, and he had that kind of gravitas. So he could carry it off very well.
If you head back into the movie's timelines, the tensions in Tombstone are continuing to rise with the Earps on one side of the law, cowboys on the other side. In particular, there's a scene where we see things almost boil over when one of the cowboys, Ike Clanton, is playing at the Oriental's Faro table with Doc Holliday. And the movie mentions that Doc Holliday has been playing for like 36 hours straight. Of course, they've both been drinking a lot. And Ike just gets more and more irate as Doc keeps winning. When the Earps sit down at the table, Virgil, as the lawman, tries to calm Ike down, but he insists that the Earps are in with the cheating with Doc, and it comes to blows when Virgil has to knock Ike out with the butt of his pistol, takes him to jail to sleep off the alcohol. But then the next day, Ike hasn't forgotten about the events from the night before, and as he rides off, he promises the Earps that a fight is coming. Can you give us a little more historical context around some of the tensions that were building in Tombstone just before the famous gunfight at the OK Corral?
Well, the Earps kind of unfairly was seen as there to clean up the town. Weren't. Yes, okay, Virgil became the marshal, but I think his idea was just like, let's keep it calm, everybody. He was not a reformer. He didn't have a mandate. This great momentum to try and turn Tombstone into a different kind of place than what it was. But because of Virgil in his position there, and he would routinely deputize Morgan and or Wyatt when he had to go arrest somebody or do some other, when you need somebody to help you, what better person to have at your back than one of your brothers? So they became this symbol of a emerging Tombstone as a more sophisticated kind of town. And it really was. In the short amount of time, the few years since the Tombstone had been founded, you had French restaurants. They were building hotels. They had, they had dancing troops, the touring dancing troops that would come to the nightclubs there, the entertainment. They had a theater. The cowboys and the rancher employers, like the Clantons and like the McLaurys, saw this as threatened. They felt threatened by all this because they started to see themselves as the old wave that was had already washed up against the shore, was receding. And so there was a resentment there that their way of life was going to be was in jeopardy and would be maybe even eradicated. You had other tensions like the first appearance was like sheep farmers, the people putting fencing off their land. It was kind of like the same kind of issues that were plaguing, and maybe Tombstone was a little ahead of its time, but plaguing areas of like Wyoming and Montana, where you had sheep farming coming in, less grassland for the cows, what had been considered public land being fenced off by new settlers. So it was. So the tension really was that the ranchers felt that they were in danger of becoming extinct, and eventually they targeted the Earps as the people who were the points of the spear, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense. They were kind of the whether or not that's actually the case, at least the way the movie implies it. They're the ones that are leading the charge. Since they kind of have law behind them, I get the impression that, well, with a lot of Old West things, it's okay, the lawmen are the only ones keeping things in check, whether or not they actually are, they weren't actually there for that. But it sounds like they got roped into it.
They did. And again, the Earps, they would have been perfectly happy not ever putting on a badge again and making money, because Wyatt for his entire life had a hard time making money. He just was one of those people that never got lucky, and every time he thought there was a chance he was going to strike it rich, the thing fell apart, when he was either in Nevada or Alaska or places like that. So here in Tombstone, I mean, it looked very promising for the Earps. Here we had at least 3 of the brothers together, and then Warren Earp would join them. They made 4 brothers together, and they had Jim Earp and his wife Bessie operating the latest bordello enterprise was in Tombstone. So you had 5 brothers together, and each having each other's backs, and their respective, girlfriends / wives with them in a booming town. I mean, this looked very promising, and then unfortunately for them, they just couldn't stay out of it. Like, hey, you guys settle your differences. We have nothing against anybody. We just want to make some money. They got caught up, swept up in the tension that was going on, and the day came when they made a stand about it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, we are at the point in the movie where the gunfight at the OK Corral happens, which I call it that because that's what everybody knows it as now, even though the movie does kind of point out that the fight itself doesn't happen at the OK Corral. On one side, we see Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan Earp, along with Doc Holliday holding a shotgun. And on the other side, the movie's camera makes it a little bit difficult to see everyone at a single time on frame, but it looks like maybe there's 6 cowboys there at first. One of them runs away as soon as the 3 Earps and Doc Holliday shows up, leaving 5. I think there's 2 pairs of brothers, Ike and Billy Clanton, as well as Tom and Frank McLowry. And then based on the movie, it looks like the last cowboy is Billy Claiborne.
Yeah. Who did not end up actually participating in the gunfight.
Oh, okay. He didn't.
I think he was persuaded or decided, wait a minute, I don't like this. I'm just going to slink off to the side here where nobody's noticing. Because I don't think he ever drew his gun and participated in the fight.
Okay.
So it was 4-on-4 really with the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday. It's kind of a funny scene if you know anything about Doc Holliday, where he sort of guilts Wyatt into letting him and Virgil to letting him become one of these deputies. I mean, almost the last person that Virgil Earp wanted to deputize would be Doc Holliday, and because you never know, he's such a loose cannon, and probably drunk, and he also, Doc Holliday was a terrible marksman with a handgun. He couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. There's numerous examples, certainly in my book Tombstone, where he gets into gunfights and he can't hit anybody.
Is that why they give him the shotgun? Feel like you just.
That's exactly why. When you see that, why does Virgil give Doc the shotgun? It's because he figures maybe with a shotgun, Doc could hit somebody. Hopefully one of them and not one of us.
That's funny because in the movie, you get the impression that Doc Holliday is the gunfighter amongst them. Like he's the one, he's super fast on the draw and he can hit anything, it seems.
Because he was a gunfighter because he got into gunfights. He just had a hard time killing anybody.
In the movie, we see that it's Doc Holliday kind of winks at Billy Clanton to get him to be the one to draw his pistol first. It looks like Wyatt Earp might actually be the first one to shoot his pistol when he hits Billy Claiborne. But by the time the shooting stops, there's 3 cowboys that are killed and Morgan Earp is injured. How well did the movie do actually showing the gunfight at the OK Corral?
It did a good job, especially, again, what I mentioned before, when you compare it to some of the other portrayals on screen. Just one example at the top of my head, there's the movie titled Gunfight at the OK Corral in 1957, I think it was, which had Burt Lancaster as Wyatt Earp. And again, you have the strange casting of Kirk Douglas as Doc Holliday. I mean, Doc Holliday is supposed to be this rather feeble guy who's barely staying alive, and suddenly he's being portrayed by Spartacus. So that doesn't make sense. But anyway, when they get to the gunfight at the OK Corral, it takes up the last 15 minutes of the movie because they're in the corral, they're running around the corral, they're running behind other buildings, shooting at each other, they're running behind horses, and the final event of that particular gunfight is Burt Lancaster chasing Billy Clanton, the youngest member of the gunfight, Billy Clanton, up some stairs into a hotel where they have the final shootout, and he kills Billy Clanton, who, by the way, is portrayed by a very young Dennis Hopper. And so the gunfight at the OK Corral, but many people are surprised to learn, was 30 seconds. There was 30 shots exchanged in 30 seconds, so it was a very intense fight. It was in an alley that was only like 15 feet across. So you're talking about 7 or 8 guys in an alley within 15 feet of each other, firing 30 times in the course of 30 seconds. It's a wonder anybody walked that.
I was going to say, how did anybody? I imagine everybody gets hit.
Well, Wyatt was the only one unscathed. Doc was hit in the hip, though it was a glancing shot. Virgil, I think, was hit in the leg, and Morgan was hit in the shoulder. And of course, the Lowry brothers were both killed, and Billy Clanton was killed, and Ike Clanton survived, mostly because when the shooting started, he made like a rabbit and bolted. So in the movie Tombstone, they do a good job because they don't stretch out the gunfight into like a 5-minute or 10-minute affair. It is over pretty quick, and it is that explosion of violence. The editor did a good job in piecing those scenes together.
Yeah, it definitely was short, and it makes sense. I guess you're talking about a movie called The Gunfight at the OK Corral. I can understand why a movie called that has to try to spread it out, but yeah, 30 seconds. That's fast. I'm sure it didn't seem like 30 seconds while you're in the middle of it, but
it probably seemed like it was 5 hours. Which bullet has my name on it? But it was over, and I think. What the real gunfight at the OK Corral, being the 30 shots in 30 seconds, the intensity of it and the sheer violence of it, it was almost like a cathartic event. All the tensions had built up between the two opposing sides. The lawmen representing the majority of people in Tombstone, and then you had the cowboys representing the past couple of decades of ranchers and cowboying from Texas into Arizona, and it was like a lightning strike. The things boiled up to the point where when they finally had a chance to go at it, they did so very intensely. It wasn't like a couple of shots were fired. Say, okay, let's call this off. It wasn't like a duel. Okay, I missed you, but at least I fired. That satisfies my honor. No, all of them were out to kill.
Is that kind of what gunfights were like in the Old West, or is that there's kind of a standout to this one that was different?
I think one thing that was very different about this one is it was held in such an enclosed space. Now, I don't mean enclosed like there was a roof. They were interior, but it was an alley.
Not in the street like you see in High Noon.
Yeah. It wasn't in the street, with the exception of Ike Clanton. None of the participants tried to hide, although there were a couple of horses in the alley that provided some cover. I think that it was in a small space with guns that were 6 shooters that you could fire, empty your 6 gun. Many people at the time carried an extra gun, so it was and that again, with the exception of Ike Clanton, who ran away, nobody at any point said, "Okay, I surrender." It was a fight. It was a fight to the finish, which a lot of times in gunfights, it was like if somebody got wounded, you just stop.
This one, it seems like everybody knew it was a fight to the finish, not just one person that way, but it seems like everybody was.
Once that first shot was taken, it was just this tidal wave of gunfire.
Well, in the movie, in the wake of the big gunfight, we see things aren't still done. We see some retaliation from the cowboys. Both Virgil and Morgan Earp are shot in separate incidents. We don't see Virgil getting shot in the movie, but after leaving Wyatt and Morgan at the Oriental during a thunderstorm one night, he wanders back in before collapsing on the floor. And according to the doctor, Virgil's going to live, but he's going to lose the use of his left arm. And then at a different time, we see Morgan playing pool at the Oriental. When he's shot through the window, Morgan's wounds are much worse, and he ends up dying in Wyatt's arms. Did those retaliations happen like we see in the movie?
Her Earp vendetta ride was exaggerated in the movie. The circumstances leading up to it portrayed pretty accurately. The one thing they mostly left out is that Wyatt and Doc and Virgil and Morgan were all arrested, or charges were levied against the 4 of them for murder, because Morgan and Virgil were wounded and recovering, they were sort of left alone. But Wyatt and Doc were actually arrested and were put on trial. The trial lasted a month. And there's a lot of testimony. And in fact, one of the things I had the good fortune is that when I began working on my book, Tombstone, they had just discovered in the bowels of the courthouse there in Tombstone a transcript of some of the testimony given during that. It was a sort of a trial, an inquiry, court of inquiry, including Wyatt Earp's. So you can get a lot of that eyewitness, really, perspective from Wyatt, which was very helpful. And at the end of this was the end of November, because the trial took up all 30 days of November. The presiding, I think his name was Wells, the presiding judge found that there was not enough evidence to, put the chains on Wyatt and Doc and haul them off to Tucson for a official murder trial. And that angered the Cowboys a lot, because from their point of view, the McLaurys and Billy Clanton were murdered. That the Earps ganged up on them. That wasn't true, but they felt very aggrieved, and they held off trying to do anything for revenge, because they said, well, let's let the court system find these guys guilty and string them up. And when that didn't happen, that's when they started to think, well, we got to do something. We got to take the matter into our own hands. And that's what happened first with Virgil. It was very close to Christmas time, I think, December 1881, where he was bushwhacked in the streets while he was making his rounds as marshal. And then, of course, mostly the Earp family circled the wagons and moved into a hotel where they could better protect they all lived together in this hotel where they could better protect each other. And it was really a restless Morgan in mid-March in 1882, that he had gone to see a play, and he was planning to meet Wyatt afterwards, which he did. And Wyatt was like, okay, let's get back to the hotel. And Morgan's like, oh, come on, we're so stuck in there all the time. Let's shoot some pool. And so he persuaded Wyatt, which he would always regret, to go to the pool hall. And like you mentioned, when it was during at the pool, they playing pool, that these bullets came through the window, and then Morgan was shot in the back. And when Doc arrived, there's this moment where, after Morgan is pronounced dead, that Wyatt and Doc sort of look at each other, and this understanding passes between them that we're not going to wait for the court system to do anything about this. We're gonna go get these guys. So whoever's responsible, we're going to track them down. So in Tombstone, they have Kurt Russell's blaring out, "Tell him I'm coming and I'm bringing hell with me," which there's some truth to that too. That he made a declaration saying to the Cowboys, get the word out, we're coming for you guys. And so he and Doc and Warren Earp, who was quite young, but he saddled up too, and several of their friends went out on this vendetta ride. Now, in the movie, it's portrayed as taking place over a long period of time, and just constantly chasing after these guys and tracking them down and shooting them down, the high body count. But if I remember correctly, I think there were 3 people killed. Now, it's still pretty impressive to track down and basically murder in cold blood 3 people, but it was not the dozen or so as portrayed in the movie. There was this bloodbath.
Yeah, the movie definitely makes it seem like, I think it's like a series of montage shots, that you see them. I think it's even some former Cowboys. They kind of throw down their red sash, and McMaster's, Texas Jack, and Creek Johnson, I think, are their names that Wyatt deputizes.
We're on the Earp side now. We're on the good guys' side now.
Afterwards, the impression I got then is that if it wasn't personal before, it definitely is personal now, because they're killing Morgan, shooting at Virgil. Do you think that is a pretty fair interpretation of what it was actually like? Was it actually personal against them? You said earlier it was almost like they felt like their way is kind of on the way out. Now, after the gunfight at OK Corral, did it almost seem personal at that point? They're not just the ones that are the visionary leaders?
That's a good question, because previously the tension against the Earps was more what the Earps represented. They had badges, and they represented the law and order faction, which was the growing majority in Tombstone. But when they lay in wait and bushwhacked Virgil and shot Morgan in the back, that was acts of violence directed specifically because they were Earps. So it was personal because there are other lawmen in Tombstone that could have been attacked to make a statement against the law and order position, but they came after the Earp brothers, and the Earp brothers were in Tombstone in the first place to watch each other's backs and make money together. And here things had deteriorated so badly that they're getting ambushed.
Speaking of ambush, in the movie, we see an ambush with Wyatt Earp when he after that montage, he goes out and he finds Curly Bill and shoots him in the river. Was Curly Bill actually the leader of the Cowboys? How was this kind of in the movie? It was almost kind of wrapping up the conflict between the Earps and the Cowboys when they kill Curly Bill, who's the leader of the Cowboys. Did it kind of wrap up that way?
It did. I mean, there's always some. It's almost like the Cowboys had two leaders, or they had Curly Bill was their more visible leader, but you had Johnny Ringo, who was almost like their spiritual leader, and so Johnny Ringo that genuinely did not like Doc Holliday. That Johnny Ringo did not like each other, and they had a confrontation that got diffused before it ended up being a gunfight. But Curly Bill and his company of men outlaws had set up a ambush for the Earp Holliday Vendetta Ride troop. So I don't think it was. I don't think that Wyatt knew Curly Bill was with this particular group. I don't think they didn't expect the group there and wait for them. When they rode into it, and Wyatt was out front. The gunfight started. The gun started shooting. Wyatt had with a shotgun, and he shot Curly Bill with the shotgun and killed him. I don't know if he died right away, but it was effective enough. And here's another example of like Wyatt, who had gone unscathed in this intense OK Corral gunfight, also being visible and guns being pointed at him. And I think the only injury he got was like a bullet bounced off he got the heel of his boot shot off, and his saddle horn got shot off. And there were bullets actually passing through the coat that he wore. But again, he escaped. He killed Curly Bill and escaped, back to where the other guys were there, and without being hit. So it's that's part of one of the ingredients that led to the legend of Wyatt Earp, was that he was unkillable.
He wasn't lucky with money, but man, he was sure lucky with bullets.
I guess the universe had the plan for him to live a long time, so he can figure out that he's never going to make money.
Yeah, you mentioned Johnny Ringo, and we do see him in the movie as kind of the after Curly Bill is killed, then the big character to kill left is Johnny Ringo, and we see Doc Holliday's health is declined a lot. He's coughing up blood. He ends up staying at Henry Hooker's ranch. Hooker's played by Charlton Heston. Again, another nice little cameo there in the movie. But then Johnny Ringo calls out Wyatt for a one-on-one at the Oak Grove near Silver Springs Canyon. So Wyatt goes to fight Ringo while Doc is back at Hooker's ranch. But it seems like Doc pretended to be worse than he was, knowing that Wyatt would lose in a gunfight with Ringo. So Doc shows up a little early and then kills Ringo under a big oak tree. How much of that actually happened like we see in the movie?
Here's where the film slips maybe into B+ territory. Because dramatically, I understand what they're doing. But by the way, talking about cameos, there's a very famous Hollywood actor, legendary Hollywood actor, in the film who you never see. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. The narrator is Robert Mitchum.
Oh, yes. Actually, I think just watching it for this time, I realized that. Yes.
Well, there's another nice cameo too, but you never actually see his face. A couple of things that are about this that aren't definitely based in fact. In his adult life, Doc Holliday was probably no healthier than he was when he lived in Tombstone. And the reason was because it was exactly the climate that his doctors back in Georgia had said to him, it's going to be the best for you. If you find this kind of climate, it'll extend your life. And here you're living in Tombstone, the southeast corner of Arizona. It's not that there's never any winter there, but it's mostly dry. You got warm temperatures. And Doc, who was never going to be robust, but he was relatively healthy. So Val Kilmer's performance is absolutely fantastic, and you can't keep your eyes off him when he's on screen. but his performance showed Doc is a much sicker man than he actually was in Tombstone. The other thing is Johnny Ringo and Wyatt never set an appointment with each other to go have a gunfight. Now, if anybody was going to fight each other, it would have been Doc and Johnny, because they had a couple of confrontations that were thwarted. But Johnny Ringo did not go to meet Wyatt Earp for a gunfight. Doc Holliday did not kill Johnny Ringo. Doc Holliday was nowhere near where Johnny Ringo died. And the general consensus is that Johnny Ringo, and for reasons that, you don't have to take up time going into, but he killed himself. He was alone, he was drunk, he killed himself. Johnny Ringo was a very complicated character, manic depressive. And he apparently got drunk and depressed enough that one day by himself, he said, this world that is being created around me, this of law and order, and the day of the cowboy's over. I don't want to live in that world anymore. And he killed himself. And Doc Holliday was hundreds of miles away. So dramatically, it's effective. And the third thing is you have Doc Holliday hitting somebody in a gunfight. What? Chances are he would. If he was facing off with Johnny Ringo and pulled his gun, the only damage would have been done to the tree behind Johnny Ringo.
That's so funny, because that's the exact, like, in the movie, throughout the movie, you see with Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, you just get the impression he's this like gunfighter that, is so I just expect he's going to have the best aim, but it's funny.
Yeah.
He's not.
Well, again, he had a reputation as a gunfighter. He had been in gunfights. He just didn't do any damage.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm just used to, the Old West movie style, like the gunfighter, he's the best one, best shot there is, and so the fact that he's not, that's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on to chat about Tombstone. For listeners who want to learn more of the true story, I'll make sure to include a link to your best-selling book, also called Tombstone, in the show notes for this episode. Before I let you go, though, I have a two-part question.
I bet I have two answers.
Okay, that's good. The first part is for listeners who have not gotten their own copy of Tombstone yet. Can you share one of your favorite stories from the book for someone who maybe has only seen the movie and wouldn't know? And then the second part is for listeners who have already read Tombstone. Can you share a peek of your latest book?
As far as the story is concerned, the movie pretty much presents Johnny Behan as a one-dimensional character. He's callow, he's cowardly, he's slimy. And there's some truth to Johnny Behan really being like that, but he was also more of a complicated character than that. He was he was the sheriff of that county. He was a pretty effective sheriff. He'd been married. He and his wife had a child who died. He and Josephine Marcus really did have a romance, and they actually lived together at one point. And with his son from his first marriage, and I think that there's more of a humanity to the Johnny Behan character than comes across in the movie. There's only room for so many stories you could tell in a movie. I understand that, and ultimately, Johnny Behan failed to do his job at the gunfight at the OK Corral. It could have been avoided completely. So, to some extent, some of that blood is on his hands. If you read my book Tombstone, I also want to give a shout out to The Last Gunfight by Jeff Gwynne, which is a very good book on the subject too, and it's very, very well researched. The Johnny Behan character is much more interesting than he's portrayed on film. So I think that's worth. And of course, the other story very quickly is that how much did Kurt Russell direct Tombstone? George Cosmatos is the director of record, but there's a fascinating story behind the making of Tombstone that Kevin Jarre had written the script and was the director, and he actually started directing the picture. But very quickly got so far behind budget that he was fired. And George Cosmatos was just coming off directing Rambo 2. He was available. They brought him in, but supposedly they brought him in as what's called a ghost director. He was just going to be the front director of record, and supposedly Kurt Russell was the actual director of the picture. And some of the other cast members will confirm that, and have confirmed it, that Kurt Russell did the actual behind-the-scenes directing. So that's another story that you won't know if you have seen only the movie, and and they obviously did a very effective job because the movie is still considered one of the top, at least in the top 20 best Westerns of all time, and a top 10 for many people's lists. My next book is coming out in May. It's called Throne of Grace. It's with my good friend Bob Drury. We've done 7 or 8 books before, including The Heart of Everything That Is and Blood and Treasure about Daniel Boone. And our new book, Throne of Grace, is about the explorer Jedediah Smith, who was followed in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark and exceeded them, actually, in his explorations of the American West. But he's pretty much an unknown figure, and he had a very adventurous life, very exciting. Really did a lot towards opening up the American West to the people back in the East who knew nothing about what was out there. We don't know. Fantastic creatures, monsters, we don't know. And Jed Smith was this intrepid, heroic figure that made all these trips back to the West Coast and back to report on his findings. And so it's called Throne of Grace. It'll be out in May, and we think the people enjoy it.
I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Thank you again so much for your time, Tom.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Tom Clavin once again for coming on to help us separate fact from fiction in the movie Tombstone. If you want to learn more about the true story, I would highly recommend you pick up Tom's best-selling book called Tombstone, The Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from Hell. You can find a link to this in the show notes for the episode, and I've also got a link to Tom's new book about another character in the American Old West, Jedediah Smith. That book is called Throne of Grace, a mountain man, an epic adventure, and the bloody conquest of the American West. You can pre-order it right now using the link in the show notes, or as always, you can find everything over on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/317. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1. Doc Holliday was a fantastic marksman. Number 2. Bat Masterson was almost in the gunfight at the OK Corral too. Number 3. The gunfight at the OK Corral was only about 30 seconds. Did you catch which one is a lie? We'll count it down. Let's start with number 3. The gunfight at the OK Corral was only about 30 seconds. That is true. While it certainly would have felt a lot longer for those that were involved, as Tom shared, the gunfight was only about 30 seconds, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, because that was back in 1881, and I'm recording this in 2024, so 143 years later, we're still talking about that 30 seconds in history. Brings us to number 2. Bat Masterson was almost in the gunfight at the OK Corral too. That is also true. That doesn't mean that the movie was wrong not to show Bat Masterson, because even though he was almost there for the famous gunfight, as we learned, Bat's brother back in Dodge City was being threatened, so he had to head back that way to help out. If he hadn't done that though, if that hadn't happened, we might have had another iconic figure in the legend of the Old West in Tombstone for the gunfight at the OK Corral. That means the lie is number 1. Doc Holliday was a fantastic marksman. Even though the movie was correct to show Doc Holliday had a reputation as a gunfighter, Tom pointed out that Doc didn't have great aim. He just was not a good marksman, which is probably why we see Virgil giving him the shotgun in the movie. But that also plays into another fictional plot point that we see at the end of the movie, because it is not true that Doc Holliday killed Johnny Ringo either. Makes for a good plot point, since the entire time in the movie, the 2 men have a rivalry with references of being each other's huckleberry. But in the true story, Doc Holliday was nowhere near Johnny Ringo when he died. And even if he was there, as Tom pointed out, Doc probably would have just hit the tree behind Johnny Ringo. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If you heard ads on today's episode, you can get rid of those by subscribing to the producer's feed. That is available natively in the Apple Podcast app just by tapping on subscribe on the show's page. Or if you're using any other podcast app to listen to this, you can access ad-free versions on the producer's feed over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/Patreon. Last but certainly not least, if you got some value out of today's episode, you can learn how to give value back to Based on a True Story and help me keep it going over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value or by tapping the value link in the show notes. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.